We'll have the overview of the mini-grid challenges and opportunities by AFUR, and then moving on to session 1, AFUR and NERC will be presenting the enhanced mini tool-grid tariff toolkit, by Malik, Kabir, and Samuel. Then we'll have our interactive discussion and a short comfort break, and we'll move on to session 2, where the presentation will be given by AFUR on the African model mini grid regulations tool and guideline documents. And we'll move into an interactive discussion, and then we'll move into the wrap up with our key takeaways and a brief feedback survey that we'll be filling in. With that, we will move on to our introduction and overview of the mini grid challenges. Samuel.
Yes, I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Samuel Sebo Abunya. I am with the African Forum for Utility Regulators, AFUR. I'm just going to turn on my video for a short minute, then so that everyone can have an idea of what I look like and not think that a ghost is speaking to them. I don't know if you can see me. That is me. I hope, and I've seen quite a number of names that I do recognize, highlighting how small the sector is, but our hope is that this sector continues to grow and expand. I know that the slides are controlled by our colleagues at South North, so maybe we can move on to the next slide so that, yes, let's keep it there for now. So just a brief introduction and overview of everything that we are going to try and do today is we're going to look at the challenges and the opportunities that are there in this, and then the focus will move to session 1 and session 2. So basically, mini grids in Africa face a challenge in the sense of regulations across the continent. There are countries, the likes of Nigeria, the likes of Zambia, the likes of Kenya, that have robust regulations that are reviewed on a consistent manner. And then there are countries like, you could say, the likes of Burkina Faso, the likes of Zimbabwe. They have really old regulations that haven't been reviewed in some time or that are in the process of being reviewed. So that kind of proves the challenge in terms of, are the current regulations there to address the current situation in the mini-grid sector. So there is a challenge when it comes to mini-grid regulations. But also when you look at mini-grids, the one way mini-grids can make money is through tariffs. And through tariffs, the expectation is that the calculation model, the methodology used should be clear. But what we have found, even as AFUR, and I'm very sure very many of you here, there are numerous calculation models out and about on the African continent, which kind of proved to be a challenge to the various sector stakeholders. I could mention a few stakeholders. Here we have the regulators, we have the private sector developers, we even have the likes of the ministries of energy, the ministries of finance, the funders, the donors, the developers. Everyone has their own distinct, like we like to say in AFU, everyone has their distinct hymn book. We're all trying to sing the same song, but using a different hymn book. So everyone is singing it in a different way, which proves to be a challenge. So the aim is, how can we calculate tariffs? What should we be looking at, and things like that. So those are some of the major challenges facing mini grids, aside from things to do with financing, access to capital, and the likes on the African continent. Here, you'll forgive me if I over-focus on the African continent, but that's where we're trying to look. Are there opportunities? Yes. For those of you who really who understand or have been following the sector, you must realize that the AUC, that's the African Union Commission, is pushing Africa towards a single electricity market. So there's an opportunity for us to, I would like to say, align, not to standardize, but to have a similar way of doing things. What this entails is, can we come together and figure out what works for Africa, what works for regions in Africa, and what works for countries in Africa? All this should be linked, hence the need for us to talk about harmonization. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. Harmonizing how regulations appear, harmonizing how tariffs are calculated. So, in a nutshell, that's a bit of an introduction that I've shared, and that's where the focus is going to be. AFUR, we have really done a lot with various partners, some of whom I've seen online here, the likes of the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association, and so on and so forth. We have tried to address some of these issues. How have we tried to address some of these issues? It's by addressing the tariff situation, the tariff methodology through the AFU enhanced mini-grid tariff tool. But also aside from that, we have developed what you call mini-grid regulation guideline templates. And this we did with our partners at Get Transform as well. And that led us to also develop the African model mini-grid regulations tool to kind of harmonize regulations. So that's where our focus is going to be in these two sessions, tariffs and regulations. And at the end of the day, we shall have our interactive sessions where we discuss, and you will see the questions here in the session, that what works for Africa, what works for the, let's say, a region, West Africa, what would work for your specific country. So now let us dive into session one directly. So in session one, I'm going to start with just a brief introduction of who AFU is. First of all, we're a Pan-African intergovernmental organization, started under AUDA NEPAD, somewhere within the AUC, and we bring together regulators of utilities on the continent of Africa. When I talk about utilities, I'm talking about energy, I'm talking about water and sanitation, I'm talking about transport and communications. We bring together all these regulators to provide them a single voice that they can speak with on the continent. Some of our key areas of work is we share best practices and regulatory experiences to various stakeholders. We also promote harmonization of market structures and facilitate development of trans-border infrastructure development and other management institutes. But also we provide a bit of oversight on various initiatives that might be required by our members, because regulation is an ever-changing thing. We can move to the next slide. Yes. So first of all, we had where all this started from is our mini grid project as AFU. And right now it's currently called the Africa Mini Grid Electrification Drive Project. The aim of the project is we want to close the gap between the regulators and the developers. And those are two broad words. Basically, what we're saying, close the gap between the public sector and the private sector through a series of guidance, documents, tools, and trainings. This project has been active since 2021. It's still ongoing. It's in phase two. It was in phase one. It's in phase two. We're already thinking about what would phase three entail. So the other thing, we also want to build capacity in terms of tariff setting and mini grid regulations. This is the general foundation of our mini grid project. What are the main objectives? You see some of them are in green, some are in yellow. Why green? Means we have achieved this. Yellow, it's ongoing. So first of all, there are a number of our full tariff tool adopters and implementers on the continent of Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa. We have developed mini grid regulation templates, and you can find these on our website, or you can reach out to the team at South North, Club ER, or even AFU, and we can provide you the link to where you can get these regulation templates. And these templates are both for financial, legal, and technical standards for mini grids. But also we have developed the Africa Model Mini Grid Regulation Tool, which we have used in a few countries to develop draft regulations for mini grids. Lastly, we have, apologies for that. Lastly, we are sharing the Africa mini grid experience on policy and the regulatory landscape with the aim of, for once, let Africa tell its story. Let it not be the story of the rest of the world to Africa. And lastly, we are creating benchmarks on CapEx and OpEx for mini grids. This is a key challenge. I believe many of you here would recognize that there is a challenge when it comes to benchmarks that speak specifically to Africa. There are global benchmarks, but if you take out things like when you take away the AMDA benchmarking Africa mini grids report, there's hardly any benchmarks dealing with capex and opex speaking specifically to Africa. And lastly, of course, I know I mentioned lastly a lot, but we also want to build the confidence between the public and private sector on the continent. That's the only way this sector will grow. Please, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Oh, yes. So now when it comes to mini grids in Africa, there, in my opinion, and the opinion of a few others, but I stand to be corrected, I'm not the one with all the knowledge on mini grids in Africa, there are three main confidence factors that are needed. The first confidence factor is the presence of clear regulatory and legal frameworks, things that detail what happens in each and every scenario. The perfect scenario is what happens when the main grid arrives. It should be clear what is done, how are people compensated, and things like that. Secondly, there should be a clear methodology of calculating the tariffs. You shouldn't have people calculating tariffs in whatever way that they desire. Let it be clear how the tariff methodology comes about, what should the formula entail, what do you allow to be included in the formula. But also, and this is something that has been growing, and we have noticed it's growing over time, there's need for trusted benchmark data on CapEx and OpEx. Global data is welcome, but African-focused data is much needed. And I just mentioned a few key stakeholders in the mini-grid sector. You have regulators, ministries of energy, ministries of finance, national planning authorities, rural electrification agencies, the communities or the users, funders and donors. This can be foundations and banks, international partners, the likes of UNDP, GIZ, FCDO, AFDB, the World Bank, and mini-grid developers themselves. So I think now you get an understanding of how wide the stakeholder bracket is in terms of mini-grids. We can move to the next slide. So our project has had quite a number of partners. In phase one, we only had three: Carbon Trust, AMDA, and Get Transform. Carbon Trust representing the FCDO. But when we move to phase two, on top of these three that are already there, we got the AFDB SAFER, COMESA, UNDP AMP, World Bank SMAP, the SC4O, the FCCC and Stroke Opera, the APRC. Now, those two are not on the African continent. They're in the Indo-Pacific region, and they are learning from what Africa is doing. So for a change, Africa is teaching another region of the world. And of course, we have Club ER as a new partner in phase two. Of course, there are discussions with GIAP and the World Bank Ascent team. We can go on to the next slide, please. And our project is governed by a project steering committee of 14 African regulators. And when I talk about regulators, I mean the energy regulators. These are just the flags of the 14 countries, but also AMDA, who are the Mini Grid Developers Association, sit on this PSC to guide us. So you remember when I spoke about public and private sector, we're trying to balance, back where I'm from in Uganda, we like to say we're balancing the both so that we hear from the public, we hear from the private sector. We can move on to the next slide, please. So what have we put out in this tool? We have had quite a number of outputs. We have put out a number of questionnaires for stakeholders to fill out. We put out a number of project reports, lessons learned reports, gap analysis reports, literature review reports, implementation reports. There are also, you remember the 14 countries I mentioned, each of those 14 countries has given a brief overview of their mini grid sector. So you can find this on our website where you can get an idea of, okay, what is happening from the regulator's perspective, let's say in a country such as Nigeria, a country such as Burkina Faso, a country such as Senegal. Those are some of the countries on the PSC. But also now the guideline templates that I mentioned, things like the technical guidelines, the legal guidelines, and the economic guidelines, which are useful for mini grids, developers and regulators to understand what should we put in our regulations or what should we be looking for or looking out for in mini grid regulations. Of course, there are a few things that are coming up. There you have the mini grid CapEx and OpEx reports. We are answering these. And of course, the early adopter implementation presentations. There are a number of the early adopters who have implemented this tool. You'll hear from one. One of our colleagues is online already, and he'll just share a bit in relation to this masterclass. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, one of the focuses where we're focusing on are the tariffs, and the AFUR Enhanced Mini-Grid Tariff tool was a key major output, or I could say is still a key major output of our project. What are some of its interesting new features? Forex volatility capabilities. That has always been an issue on the continent of Africa. And we all understand that a challenge when it comes to tariffs is developers get capital in foreign exchange. This could be in US dollars, in euros, in British pounds, as well as in certain cases now the Chinese yuan. However, the tariffs, which are their main sources of income, cannot, in 99% of the time, they cannot be charged in these foreign currencies. They are charged in the local currencies. In Uganda, it's the Uganda shilling. It could be the South African rand. It could be the Rwandese franc and things like that. So a forex volatility capability enabling you to calculate a forex volatility adjustment to add to the tariff is a new feature. The second new feature is the portfolio sites input, where it's becoming pertinent that as more and more mini grid developers now start saying we have a portfolio of sites, it might make more sense to do one portfolio site application instead of doing, let's say, 20 different applications. Then, of course, the different power source calculations. I've noticed this as we have moved around as AFUR in Africa, that most times, whenever people start talking mini grids, somehow everyone's mind shifts to solar. But that is not the case. Mini grids can also be small mini hydro, they can be wind, they can be biogas. Strangely, from one of the countries who helped us through this project, they mentioned even floating biogas. So these are some of the new interesting new features. We can move to the next slide. This is just a snapshot of some of the things in the tool. We can go on to the next slide. Yes, so who were the early adopters? I'm very sure you had me talking of early adopters. We had Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Zimbabwe. Of course, we had the Africa Energy Services Group helping us with this project. We had reviewers such as the ECA, Get Transform, World Bank SMAP, UNDP AMP, AFDB CEFA, INENSUS, COMESA, and we have quite a number of implementing partners like AMDA, Get Transform, UNDP AMP, and COMESA. Now, I would like to say, what is the status of our AFUR tool, which is going to focus on the tariffs in just a minute? We had 4 of the early adopters are using the tool in varying capacities. Nigeria is in full transition. Well, they're fully transitioned to the AFUR tool, and you'll see it in their section. The other 3, we could say Sierra Leone is already on the journey with the reforms to their regulations and things like that. Then, of course, Burkina Faso and Zimbabwe are using it in their own capacity. The next steps is to have quite a number of people using the tool as well. And that's where we have reached out to a number of partners, such as the UNDP, such as COMESA, who have helped us to achieve this. So that's good for us. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So now, session one, where we're looking at the AFUR enhanced mini-grid tariff tool. And let's move to the next slide. The main question that we're trying to address is tariffs. First of all, what is a tariff? In simple terms, the tariff is the pricing plan an energy provider is going to give you this electricity. How much they charge you in order to access the electricity. In most cases, and don't worry, when you get the presentation, some of these things will be properly aligned. The simplistic way to look at the tariff formula is simply what's the allowed revenue or revenue requirement divided by the forecast demand for energy or the energy sold. And usually what makes the allowed revenue are things to do such as the operating expenses, the regulated asset base, the weighted average cost of capital, and the depreciation stroke recovery cost for assets. Sometimes incentives can be added or subtracted from this formula, but that's a discussion for another day. We can move to the next slide. So what should we be aiming for, most especially here in Africa, when we are looking at tariffs? There are 8 pillars that you need to look at that will help you assess a tariff, most especially for mini grids. And you will be able to know what does this pillar communicate. This is in brief. First of all, the cost structure. What is the capex, the opex, the financing? Here you will basically be able to assess that, and you will start to understand the baseline tariff requirement. At the very least, what's the average tariff that I should be charging to meet all these costs that I have? Secondly is the demand profile. What does the load factor look like in the area you're promising to serve? Are there any productive uses there? Because believe you me, when it comes to mini grids, and in Africa, I don't know why we have focused mini grids to say that they're in rural areas, they do need to have productive uses attached to them. And why that is important is because once you attach productive uses, you end up having a bit of what we would call an anchor customer. Away from that, what does this communicate? Is this tariff going to be sustainable? It's sustainability. Because most times when you don't have what you would call an anchor customer, and if we go by the definition of mini grids in Africa being in rural areas, sometimes you could argue that people might not be able to actually afford the true price of electricity. The next pillar, which is the third, is the regulatory philosophy. We're looking at cost reflectivity versus a uniform tariff. Here you're communicating the allowed tariff direction, and this one is specifically focused to you as public sector. Thirdly is the subsidy architecture. Is it on CAPEX? Is it on OPEX? Is it output-based? This is communicating how affordable will the tariffs then become. Next, we look at the tariff methodology. What are we looking at? Time of use, flat rate. And here it's kind of communicating the incentive alignment. And then you look at the risk allocation. This is Africa. We have political risk, whether you like it or not. In most African countries, there's political risk. I already spoke about the foreign currency risk. And sadly, because we can't escape these other two, there's the grid arrival risk. So this tends to communicate to the bankability of projects. Then, of course, we look at affordability. That's the 7th pillar. And here we're looking at what are the incomes like in the area you want to go to. Are there any alternative sources to the energy that you are proposing to provide? When we talk about alternative sources, do you have a competitor in terms of another mini grid? Is the national grid there, hypothetically speaking? Or the local energy sources, when you look at Africa, things like charcoal, firewood, kerosene, and things like that. This also tends to look at how socially viable is your tariff going to be, because there's no point charging a high tariff and people just can't simply afford it. Lastly is the electrification strategy. What are the grid plans and what is the compensation model? Here we tend to look at the long-term security of projects. So I think when you look at these pillars, you start to understand that's why the stakeholder group can be that wide. Otherwise, we'd simply say it's the regulators and the developers and consumers and stop there. But this provides you with an idea of why such a large stakeholder group is involved. We can move to the next slide, please. So what are some of the major tariffs used in Africa? As AFUR, we have kind of moved around a lot when we have been taking up around our tariff tools, our regulations tool. And we have seen that most tariffs fall within these 6 broad categories, which are the cost reflective tariff, the uniform or single buyer tariff, which tends to be the national tariff, subsidized tariffs, a hybrid, which is a mixture of any of the tariffs mentioned above, and of course, time of use or demand-based tariffs, as well as a flat rate, which is subscription-based. Yeah. So when we look at in terms of Africa, in terms of which are the main 5, the most dominant is cost reflective. But also where governments are trying to get involved, you'll find that there's a bit of subsidized uniform tariffs. And of course, there's the hybrid subsidized tariffs. And then the flat rate tariff, which is really for very small and solar home systems in the continent. Then, of course, we have the lifeline tariffs. And these tend to be used selectively and mostly on the grid systems. The challenge that mini grids face is that many regulators insist, please have a bit of a lifeline tariff. Is it affordable for mini grids? That's a question for them to discuss. We can move on to the next slide, please. So now getting into each of them, the cost reflective tariff. This is actually based on the true cost of power, generating, distributing, and supplying it. Why it's important, mini grids are small, but they have high per kilowatt hour costs. And the only way to really attract private developers, and I stand to be corrected, is by allowing them the cost reflective tariffs. Key examples include ERA, Uganda, that approves project-specific cost-reflective tariffs for mini-grids, Nigeria's mini-grid regulations, and you're about to hear about the Nigerian situation, allow for fully cost-reflective tariffs. The same goes for Zambia's Electricity Regulation Board. We can move to the next slide, please. These are just examples of the tariffs. Then we do have subsidized or cross-subsidized tariffs, government grants, donor funds, or utility cross-subsidization is used to lower tariffs. In certain situations, fellow customers can subsidize other customers. And we have seen this in Kenya, Tanzania, and Senegal, just to mention a few. That's one tariff model. We can move on to the next slide, please. Then, of course, the one which most mini-grid developers do not like, the uniform tariff or the national tariff or single buyer tariff. Here they tell you, we don't care where you're going in the region. We don't care what your costs are. You're going to charge the national tariff. These can work if they're subsidized because cost of production is always higher for mini grids than for the national grids. Some examples include in Kenya, South Africa, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso as well, where COPELs exist. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Now here we have 2, where we have the hybrid. So you could have let's say, a cost-reflective tariff with a bit of subsidy, with a bit of efficiency incentives. These most people try to use this to balance affordability and viability. And when we talk about viability, we mean that you don't want the mini grid to collapse. In business terms, they say, let the business continue being a going concern, something like that. Here we have seen it in Nigeria. We have also seen it in Uganda. So I think you're starting to see a trend in terms of which countries on the African continent tend to be the most highly developed. And I know very many African countries sometimes don't like to hear it, but the fact on the African continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, and I could be corrected, but the most mature mini grid market is Nigeria. So all the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa are aspiring to be where Nigeria is, but at the same time, Nigeria is trying to move beyond where it is. Continuing on in terms of the tariffs, we are next looking at lifeline tariffs. Now, these are tariffs for the poorest of the poor. That's like my boss at AFUR likes to say. These are tariffs for people who can't really afford them. In certain cases, such as seen in Uganda, they kind of put a lifeline tariff in terms of the initial consumption slab. So basically, the first few units of electricity you use are given at what some people would call a lifeline tariff. And they tend to be very cheap. Uh, like I've explained, these can be very mini grids don't tend to like lifeline tariffs because it's just in the definition for the poorest of the poor. But also given the fact that mini grids tend to have high capex costs, and if we look at the true cost reflectivity, it means that that the tariff should ideally be higher than what the governments would consider as lifeline tariffs. So we can continue on to the next slide. Then the other interesting one, which I tend to find very interesting, is the time of use tariff and the demand-based tariffs. And these vary based on peak and off-peak capacity and things used. I know, for example, this is used in Tanzania, this is used in Uganda, Nigeria uses it as well. I know countries such as Liberia, countries such as Cameroon are exploring how to use this, but for them, it's shifting away from time of use now to seasonal tariffs, where in times of heavy rains, you say, okay, what tariff should we charge? In times of less rain, and this is looking at mini grids in terms of hydro, because that's their main source. They look at, okay, how much should we charge? And those are all very interesting ways to look at tariffs in terms of the time and the demand use. Then you have things like the flat rate tariff, which is subscription based. And here you have where it's fixed. It can be daily, it can be weekly, it can be monthly, regardless of how much energy you consume. You know, once that period ends, you're disconnected. We can move on to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague from the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, Malik, to just give you a bit of, I would like to call it a case study, uh, just to give you an understanding of tariffs from their perspective as Nigeria. So I hope Malik is able to unmute. Yes.
Yes,
All
yes.
right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Samuel. My name is Engineer Malik Kabir from the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission here in Nigeria. I'm pleased to share Nigeria's experience with the AFUR mini-grid tariff rule tool and our broader regulatory framework for mini-grids. Maybe if we move to the next slide, please. Let's start with the regulatory foundation because it's clear. Without clear framework, no tariff can be effective. We start with the Electricity Act. It was a game changer for Nigeria, as it clearly defined who regulates what. So NAC handles the federal level oversight, while states can now regulate mini grids within their territories. Um, for states who haven't yet established their uh, framework, NAC continues to provide such oversight, ensuring no regulatory gaps exist, pending when they have established their own um, regulation or market. Then we will hand over regulations to those states. Um, um, for the mini grid regulations, it's simplified permitting process of up to 1 megawatt, meaning that we have classified mini grids to be 1 megawatt or less at the moment. We divided the permitting process as well into two. So we have registration, and then we also have permit. For registration, it's 100 kilowatt or less, which has less requirement. And then we have permit, which could be anywhere from 0 kilowatt or 1 to 1 megawatt, which is a bit has a bit more requirements to it. For registration, the thing is simple. So it means you have your mini grid. So you just basically you are notifying the commission that you have a mini grid at a particular site, and then should be aware of it. So you're basically just registering it. Um, so so that's that. Another innovation for the mini grid regulations 2023 that we have is the introduction of portfolio applications. I think it was worked on with the AFUR tariff tool as well, because the AFUR tariff tool provides the portfolio applications. So we needed to change the mini grid regulations as well to allow for that. So developers could now like register multiple mini grid sites under a single application. This creates economies of scale and reduces administrative costs to it. There's also clear grid arrival compensation mechanism. So if the mini grid arrives at the mini grid location, developers are protected. The investment isn't lost. So they could um, um, should I say, enter into an agreement with the school, like a different agreement. There could be maybe an embedded generator to the school, or they could also continue to supply the community. It just depends on the mutual agreement between the school and the developer. And then also it's as Mr. Think Samuel mentioned earlier, it's technology neutral. It means like it's uh, it's not just solar, it's also small hydro, biomass, and hybrid system as well. So it accommodates all renewable energy sources. On scale, the results speak for themselves. So since the mini-grid regulations were started in the country, the Commission has approved over 400 mini-grids till date. Now we'll look at the how we structure tariffs to make projects viable while keeping electricity affordable. If we could move to the next slide, please. Okay. So, Nigeria takes a flexible approach to mini grid tariffs. We believe developer closest to the market should have options. So we permit fully cost-reflective tariffs. This is fundamental. If developers can't recover their costs, they won't invest at all. But then developer can choose their pricing approach. So some opt for like uniform pricing, same rate for everyone, but others could implement like tiered structured approach with cross subsidization. This means that they could provide, let's say, those unproductive or commercial use could pay more than those in a residential um, um, sector or residential customers, meaning that residential people will pay less than those who do it for productive use. This is purely like a decision for the developer to make, and then it depends on how they think they will recover their costs basically. On tariff, some numbers is that with regards to subsidies, so without subsidy support, mini grid tariffs usually range between 420 naira to 550, sometimes a bit more. That's about 28 cents to 36 US cents. With subsidies, the tariffs usually drop to around 290 to 380 naira, which is about 19 to 25 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's about 25 to 35% reduction because of the application of subsidies, which makes real difference for consumers. This is how affordability and just sustainability are balanced. The cost-reflective base ensures developers can operate profitably. Strategic subsidies bridge the gap uh, to what consumers can actually pay. So can we move to the next slide? So yes, Nigeria has been fortunate to partner with World Bank and African Development Bank on two transformative programs. I think through the REA, that is the Rural Electrification Agency. So on the NEP, that's the Nigeria Electrification Project. It has been running since 2018, and it uses like two main mechanisms. The first is the performance-based grants, which developers receive around 350 to 600 US dollars per verified connection. Um, and then the second one is the minimum subsidy tender. This is a competitive bidding where developers compete on who needs the lowest capex subsidy to serve a particular area. So it's like a reverse auction that drives efficiency. So the result is about 173 mini grids completed under the NEP program. And then after the NEP, which is phase one, then we moved to the Darius program as well, which I think started in 2023, 2024, and it's still running, it's still in progress. This is like a $750 million facility with $410 million specifically for mini grids. The ambition is significant, so over 1,200 planned mini grids to reach our 17 million Nigerians. Um, Importantly, like DRS supports both the isolated mini grids and interconnected mini grids. So isolated, those that are off-grid, no distribution network, and then the interconnected mini grids, those who are connected to the distribution network. So the mechanism is straightforward. CapEx subsidies reduce the upfront investment developers need to make while lowering capital cost, mean developers can charge lower tariffs while still being profitable. And then accountability is built in, no results, no payment, basically. So that's that. So now I'll share like a few experience we had with the AFUR tariff tool. If we could move to the next slide, yes. Uh, we were an earlier adopter. We adopted the standardized from AFUR, and our journey has been instructive. So on the timeline, in that
Um, think Malik will just experience a bit technical issues. In the meantime, while he's busy sorting that out, Samuel, can we have one question for you, and can you answer it in the meantime?
What was the question? I've avoided looking at the chat. That's what's yeah, I guess.
No problem. It's a question from Irasha. And how is the political risk incorporated in the tariff calculation?
Wow, that's a very good question. It's hard to avoid the fact that you can't separate electricity from politics. That's the first thing. And it's hard to actually incorporate it into into the calculations for the tariffs. Why it's hard to do that is because you don't know what the politicians are going to say the next day or what they're going to do. Case in point, Tanzania, we all remember what happened in Tanzania. They woke up one day and said, this is what we are going to do. And we had to accept that that was the situation in Tanzania. The only thing you can hope for and really wish for is that if there are legal regulations, if there are frameworks in place already, it means that it will be hard for the shifting political trends to change what those legal frameworks are, as long as they are robust and clear. I think we've all seen it. I like to use the example of Nigeria. Yes, the politics keeps changing here and there, but the regulations and the frameworks are the same. So there's that certainty, which tends to kind of bring a challenge in terms of I'm trying to find the right word. It tends to bring a challenge for the mini grid sector in terms of the perceived risk and the sources of capital. Because if there's a lot of political upheaval and that political upheaval affects how the mini grid tariffs come about, if the government can just wake up and change the tariff or the tariff levels, it means that if the developers are looking for funding, someone is going to attach a very high cost because of that uncertainty. So that's the challenge with it. It's hard to incorporate it in because political risk is not quantitative, if you understand what I mean. You can't put a number on political risk. It's there. It's always there. And in Africa, regardless of the country you're in, it's there at varying levels. You just can't put a figure to it. I hope that answers the question in some way or some form.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
true. Thanks, Raisha.
All right.
So,
Malik is back, so I think he can
Yeah,
continue.
awesome.
yeah,
Thank you.
apologies as I had a slight network glitch. Um, so yes, I was talking about the tariff tool adoption. So the first one we had was in 2018, I believe. That's when we first started using a tariff tool. And back then, the tariff tool had like nine sheets there, a lot of sheets. So the developers and then the reviewers of the tariff also the commission also need to go through all the sheets to fill out and review the different numbers in there. But then in December 2024, we transitioned to the AFUR enhanced tariff tool, which we call like version 6. It's a version 6 to us. So we made it mandatory for all applications since then to use the tool. So it's on our website as well and easily accessible. So while adopting the tool, we didn't just adopt it as it was handed over by Apple. We customized it to be like Nigeria specific. As soon as we started, I think test running it, we found out that we needed some more information about the developer and the project. And that's missing in the tariff tool. So we created a sheet to get some brief information about the project and the developer. So meaning that the name of the site, the location, name of the developer, contact details, so that we could easily identify, okay, this tariff sheet is for this project and this is the location and the rest. We further customized it to include, to be able to capture a list of up to 20 sites in the new sheet we created. So we could have like a list of sites if you're applying for a portfolio application. So you just list out the information of the different sites in there. There's a table we had. Another customization we did was we capped the technical grid loss at 4%. So we went to that particular field and then we implemented data validation. And then the technical grid loss will not go beyond 4%, because that is what we had or we have in the regulation, the mini grid regulation 2023. So we put in that validation in there. Also, after we started using it, a few developers came in and wanted to implement time of use tariff methodology. And then we noticed that it wasn't fully developed in the tariff tool. So we went ahead and spoke with AFUR, Mr. Samuel, and then we enhanced the time of use section and then reissued the tool to the developers so that they could use the time of use and then submit, and then we will review the tariff. So those are the things, some of the customization we did. We'll continue to do to implement some customizations as the need arises, and then yeah. So that's it for the customization. So some benefits and challenges is that the transparency this tool provides is invaluable. We can now see that when systems are over-designed, when developers are like specifying more capacities than the community actually needs, like that's usually what happens. Developers will um, specify or over oversize some their plans, and then but this AFUR tariff tool usually it makes it easy to spot over design. So we get back to the developers and then they also review their specs for the plant. Another benefit is the portfolio applications. Like I mentioned earlier, it's provides economies of scale, and it makes it easy for the developers as well to just apply and then have a lot of multiple sites to be approved and the rest. One challenge is that the financial information, usually it's a bit difficult for the developers to get completely accurate. It makes it a bit difficult for them to pinpoint, to fill out. But this is an area that we are continue to provide capacity building and training to developers, and then yeah, hopefully with time everything will be clearer and easier to address. Moving to the next slide, there's some maybe recent development we did concerning mini grids. So in December, that's last month, we issued a new commercial guideline to the sector. So this guideline provided key information regarding three sections or three parts. Number one is the dues, that's the rental fee, then the cost of energy, and then legacy debt. So we noticed that there's sometimes some friction between the developer and then the disco. For IMGs specifically, they tend to not agree on the amount the developer would pay to the disco on the use of the infrastructure they have in a particular area of that the IMG will operate in. Also, there's some maybe misalignment on the cost of energy. So meaning if the disco is selling power to the IMG, what's the tariff that the disco will sell to the IMG? That's also a point of agreement. And then also the legacy debt as well. So sometimes the IMG will come to a community or to a feeder, an area, and then the people or the consumers in that area are owing the disco certain amount of energy amount, for example. So the developer will need to help the disco recover such debt from the consumers. So for that, we capped it at 10%. So for every time the consumer wants to vend credit, so 10% of that will be used to offset the debt for that consumer. So those are the things like we issued a guideline for. So calculating the rental fee dues was clear. And then the cost of energy as well, what the disco will charge for selling the energy is also clear in the guideline. So we just standardized everything and made it easy for the to close out on these agreements and then have the IMGs just get to commercial close and then start operation as soon as possible. So yes, the IMG guideline addresses those barriers, and then the impact, expected impact is to enhance bankability of the interconnected mini-grid projects, support DISCO's mandate to migrate customers to higher service bands, because here in Nigeria, consumers have we have different service bands for consumers. We have band A, which have a supply of like availability of more than 20 hours a day, and then so band B have slightly less service availability for that. So this will allow the disco, for example, people who are in band, for example, C and D, once an IMG comes to and supplies power to those feeders, they will be migrated to a higher band, meaning that they will get more power supply during the day. Maybe we could get to the next slide. So yes, that's it. To summarize, we have built an investment-friendly regulatory framework. We allow flexible tariff structures. We have a robust subsidy programs to bridge the availability gap. Um, that's through the two programs we mentioned, the NEP and the DRS. We use the AFUR tariff tool for standardized and transparent tariff determination, and we continue to evolve regulations to address emerging needs, like the interconnected mini grids in the country. That's it from me. Then, Mr. Samuel, do you want to take over?
Thank you so much, Malik. And that's basically session one on the tariffs. You have had about the tariffs, calculations, our food tariff tool, and also gotten a bit of a context in terms of Nigeria. And like I said at some point during our session, that whether we like to admit it or not, Nigeria is the most mature mini-grid market in sub-Saharan Africa. And most countries, or if not all countries that want to enhance mini-grids, should be aspiring to reach Nigeria at whatever level and size that they are. So I know this next session is more of an open discussion, feedback questions, where I answer some. I believe there are some. I've started seeing the notifications, which are directed specifically to you, Malik, in terms of the Nigerian experience. So we'll try to answer them as best as we can. But at the end of the day, I also want us to have an open discussion on what kind of tariffs can work in the context of Africa. You can give your opinions either in the chat, or if you get a chance, you when you speak, you can address it continentally, regionally, or if you want to specifically look at the country that you're from or that you're currently based in. So, Nina, I don't know how we'll do this. I know there might be quite a number of questions in the chat. So perhaps you could guide this session on the open discussion and the questions.
Sure. Everyone they can unmute their mics and raise their hand if they would like to ask a question or answer towards the open discussion on what can work in the context of Africa. Would you first like to address the questions, or we can just go ahead with the discussion first?
I think we should first address the questions, then we go to the open discussion. Yeah.
Okay, there are quite a few questions, but majority is that to Malik. But while we have Malik, we might as well also address the questions. So there is a question from Tokinia Ina asking, is the tool intended as a normative instrument to be imposed by a regulator or as a decision support tool? How can excessive tariff rigidity, be avoided if the tool becomes a mandatory national reference?
Okay, I think I can answer this. And I think you've had like the case of Nigeria. Usually there's a methodology, and a country can develop a tool, and the expectation, whoever is going to set up a mini grid in terms of getting their permits, their tariffs approved, has to use that tool to determine what the tariffs are. It's not that the actual tariff given is the tariff that will be approved. There has to be a bit of discussion if necessary, or you can take what the tool says. But at the end of the day, the way the AFUR tool is designed, and Malik kind of hinted on it, is that all the necessary information that is required to structure your tariff is calculated, but you can use whatever formula you want to determine what the tariff will be. He gave you the example of time of use. It's not that you determine the time of use tariff specifically, but you wouldn't know the information on, okay, what is the revenue requirement? The tool, here I'm speaking about the AFU tool. The tool has calculated it for you. What is the demand? The tool has calculated it for you. So perhaps the thing that you can use for example, the time of use is to determine during the day, during the night, what do I charge? What's the revenue I obtain, or the revenue requirement attached to that period, and things like that. So it's not that the tool is going to say, this is the tariff structure you should use. The tool just calculates each and everything that you need. And if you recall in the opening of the session there, you saw the simplistic definition of the tariff and its simplistic formula. Simply the revenue required or allowed revenue divided by forecast demand, or the energy you sell. Those are two figures that are calculated by the tool. But you yourself, as let's say, as a developer, can then say, no, I'm not going to use that method to calculate my tariff. I like to give an example. Someone will say, I'll use LCOE plus 20%. That's also okay. The tool can help you calculate that. In terms of rigidity, the rigidity is not necessarily there as long as you have some freedom to structure the tariffs as a developer. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if Malik has anything to add, but from our end, that's how we look at it. Yeah.
No, I don't have anything to add. Samuel have answered it all. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. And we can move to the next question, Nina.
From Maria Martin, how is the coefficient beta in the return on equity for the mini grids estimated?
I think this goes into in terms of return of equity. By the time you come to this point, you should have calculated your return on equity, because in the tool, what we would then want is, what is the return of equity, because remember there are three possible sources for capital in terms of mini grids. If we're looking at the private sector, you could call it the debt, then the equity, which is your own equity. So and then the other source is a grant, which somehow when you look at the cost, it becomes a zero. So when you look at these other two, you then determine what the returns on those two are, and then you calculate the weighted average cost of capital. So ideally, you should have calculated that when you're coming up with what your return on equity is. So it has to be factored in. Then once you get that return on equity, you then input it into the tool as your cost of equity, return on equity under the equity bit, and the tool will then go ahead to calculate for you the weighted average cost of capital. I hope I've answered Maria.
So we have one last question. There was a hand up. I don't know where the person's hand.
Mr. Belayene.
Yes.
I do not know.
Okay, I think they dropped their hand. We can move on to the last question. For now, and we can carry on with the open discussion. And this is, oh, there we go. Hi.
Can I step in?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Balaina. This time I'm from not the government side, but from the private side, Samuel. So my comments on your presentation is on confidence factors. I think one of the confidence factor that should to be considered is political stability. And the second, I would appreciate if you could include sovereign guarantee. Oftentimes, the private sector questions these things as a confidence factor. And for the Nigerian guy, I would have one question. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead. We can hear you.
So this time, the technology is on the basis of energy as a service is flooding all over around the world. But we are still sticked into the mini grid advocation. Would you comment whether the energy service issue is taken care side by side with mini grid development? Is my question clear?
Yes,
Hello?
I believe so.
I think it is clear to Malik.
It is clear, yeah?
Yeah.
On the pillar side, on your presentation, Samuel, you have mentioned affordability issue. But from my experience, it is not only affordability issues that should to be taken care. Acceptability is an issue also. Acceptability is also an issue.
Yeah.
Because the public may boycott because of acceptability issue. They can afford it, but they may negate not to accept it.
Yeah.
So so that also has to be taken care. Otherwise, we cannot handle the issue of mini grid development without that aspect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Belene. I think for me there were more comments and feedback, so I'm just going to hand straight to Malik, who was asked a question in itself.
Okay, yes. Thank you for the question. I think your question asked about whether mini grids in the country, in Nigeria, have also been developed side by side with utility, right? That's the main grid. And then the answer is yes. Mini grids had been promoted in the country, as well as the main grid. And the idea for this, I think, is to they complement each other. While mini grids help in faster deployment of electricity, most especially in the rural areas. So areas that are way outside the coverage of the main grid. It will take years for them to get electricity, but within months, mini grids will easily be deployed there, and then they will enjoy electric supply much faster and easily. Another thing is that mini grids also complement through the main grid as well. Like I mentioned earlier, the interconnected mini grids, they are connected usually in the urban areas, and then we see that because here we usually sometimes don't get enough electric supply for consumers. So mini grids deployed will boost the availability of electricity in those areas. So mini grids are faster and easier to deploy than main grid electricity. But because a main grid requires like significant investment, which are ongoing, so there's investment or reforms in the generation side. There are investments in the transmission sides. They have their own challenges as well. And then there's also investment in the distribution side as well. So all of these are ongoing, even though it's a bit slow, but they're still ongoing. But we wanted to also promote to see how mini grids can come in and to see how we could like hasten it or make it to quickly deploy such in places. Also, there's this also should I say intention to provide um, solar integration to the grid as well. So it's not just mini grids. Mini grids are like 1 megawatt or lower, and so there are small sizes capacities. So there are talks and plans to also have like large scale solar be integrated into the grid, like 5 megawatts, 10, 20 megawatts of solar to be directly injected into the grid at a much larger scale. So yes, we are looking at it and we're developing frameworks and then to see how we could achieve those in the coming months or years. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Malik. I hope that answered your question, Mr. Belania.
Yeah. Hello, can I have a heart?
Yeah, did it answer? Okay. So moving on, since we took quite the time on the questions, we can just move on the open discussion.
Yeah,
So
the two raised hands. Yeah, we can have the open discussion around the two raised hands.
I'm sorry
Shimaboy.
for intervention. I'm sorry. I don't think I'm correctly captured by the respondent. My question is, in these days of technology, energy as a service is being given door to door. So given that, how would you see in the case of Nigeria in the development of mini grid development undertakings?
Well, the mini grids by its nature, like electricity is door to door. So mini grids go to the communities down, and then of course like they go to door, and then like they meter everyone, and they know the consumers, and then they provide such services to them. I don't know, maybe I don't
Kabir,
yeah.
are you familiar with the concept of energy as a service?
Yes, I believe so. Unless maybe
Yes,
it means maybe different things, maybe to
yes.
us. But
Okay,
if you
thank
could
you, thank
explain
you,
maybe
thank
what
you.
you mean
I think
specifically.
the context might be different. Mr. Belayani, you
Yeah.
Yeah,
might be looking at it from an Ethiopian point of view, compared to Malik, who's looking at it from a Nigerian point of view.
thank you, Kabir, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much. So sorry about this, everyone. I know you have a few questions, and we can address them later as well. But just to end off the session, we'd like to do the open discussion as well. So Samuel will be we can go ahead with the open discussion. Just
Well,
5 minutes on there,
okay.
and then we can just move on to our short comfort break as well, if
Yeah.
that's fine with you.
Yeah, I guess it's okay. And well, usually we say if there's a lot of discussion and you leave the respondents slightly disgruntled, it's good for you in the sense that people were paying attention. So I don't know if I do see a hand. So feel free to also address the open discussion question. So we just have 5
Yes.
minutes for this.
Yes,
Like
thank you. Thank you very much,
yes.
Samuel. I mean, this is Abu Bakr bin Aziz from Morocco. First, thank you very much for this session. I'm very happy to see that in Africa we have reached this level of reflection and discussion on this topic. I mean, I will focus more like on renewable energy microgrids. Since there is like a huge potential, I mean, in Africa, and here I speak more about like solar and batteries, and this kind of investment involves like a lot of risk. I mean, first like intermittence, since like the production is very much like unpredictable, but only like available during the day. The second is the risk of payment, and I'm afraid like most of the like the tariff models like we have discussed do not fit for this kind of investment, and here like there is like more effort that should be done within like the government, the local authorities in order like to do this kind of investment. So this is not like a power or like an energy that we can control or that we can manage, available basically most of the day but not available in the night. And here we should maybe think of more innovative like models to encourage people to consume energy basically during the day and during like the peak hours. And second, more involvement like of the government, of like the local authorities, in order like to be involved in the capex investments, in order like to de-risk a little bit and control the risk like within like this kind of investments. So this is like the point I wanted to bring up, and I wanted maybe like that we could discuss further if we have like the time. Thank you very much.
Apologies, I was in mute. Yes. I do understand your position, and I think those are things that we should openly discuss here, mainly to consider for the rest of Africa. The question I would put to you is, well, how would it look like in the case, and it's good you mentioned you're in Morocco. Most people realize that Northern Africa, that's like Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, you could say you've kind of left the rest of Africa behind. So I do understand. I don't know what the other people on the call would like to say to that, but I do think it's something important that we should consider. I know there are lots of countries which are considering, in quotes, productive uses of energy, adding it so that the peak demand goes up and things like that, which kind of makes it affordable. But like I said, this is still a very expensive business, in summary. So yeah.
Yes, I mean it's expensive, but there is like a huge potential in Africa, especially if we speak about solar. So it can be like very very feasible. The main problem is this is like a power that we cannot control. It's available during the day, and the fact that only people would pay only for a few hours wouldn't like make the business like feasible, and here like subsidies are very important in order like to in order like to risk a little bit like the investment. On the other hand, I mean we are going to win like a lot by this kind of mini grids. I know that a lot of examples have been done, like basically like in South Africa using solar and using batteries. We reduce a little bit like our CO2 like footprint. We decrease like the investments related to cabling, related to importation. I mean, so there is like a lot to gain. But like on the other hand, for this kind of projects, I mean, to succeed, the basic business models are not like applicable in order like to ensure their feasibilities. This idea of time of use tariffs, I mean, it fits a lot. Basically to reduce the tariffs maybe like in the peak hours where solar is available. This could like solve part of the problem, but otherwise, I mean, this kind of investment wouldn't like make any sense if the government is not willing like to subsidize, if the government is not willing like to make like a safe, fair environment for investors to be involved.
Okay. I guess that comes down now to governments themselves being predictable and supportive of the sector. That's quite good.
Exactly.
I don't know if there are any other comments. Nina, you will guide us on the time at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think we can close the session and we can go for a 5-minute comfort break. It's 12:26 on my side. So by 12:31 we can all come back and continue with session 2. I'd like to thank Malik for his time and his input as well. If you are staying on, please you may address some of the questions in the chat box as well. And let me not take up any of your time further ado. So we'll be back in 5 minutes and return at 12:31 South African Standard Time. I'm sorry for not giving the other time zones at the moment. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's off now. Then you use the. All right. Welcome back, everyone, to our second session. I hope you guys can hear me, and maybe hopefully there aren't any technical issues. And if there's any technical issues, just feel free to let us know in the chat box. So for session 2, Samuel, I will be doing the session with you just to give Nina some breather. So for session 2, the first presentation will be on AFUR, African Model Mini Grids Regulation Tools and guideline documents. And this will be presented by, sorry, I thought I had my camera on. This will be presented by Samuel. So please feel free to take the floor, Samuel. And then just like also a heads up, so we'll have this presentation and then it'll be followed by interactive discussion. Also, Samuel will also take a lead on this one. And then towards the end, then we'll have like an interactive wrap up summary. And if there's any leftover questions that need to be addressed, that will be the perfect time for us to do that. But for now, Samuel can take the floor and yeah, go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, Sihive. Yeah, so we tend to find that this session ends up being shorter than the tariff session because tariffs touch everyone. But now, continuing on, and here we're looking at the regulation side of things. In our project, we did come up with what we call the AFUR, Africa Model Mini Grid Regulations tool. I think most of us here who have been engaged in the sector know how long it can take to develop a mini grid regulation. Just even a review of a mini grid regulation can take ages and forever. And we've found that usually the challenge is no one wants to do the first draft, if you think about it. So as AFUR, together with our partners in this case, Get Transform, we realized how can we assist African countries? Because as we were implementing this project, as we were looking at tariffs, we realized 3 things about the African continent. There are 3 subcategories that you could throw the African countries in. Category 1 are countries like Nigeria. There are regulations, they have tariff tools and things like that. Pretty robust. You would call them, these are the mature markets. Category 2, you could say they have regulations, but have no tools. Maybe the regulations haven't really been addressed in a few years, but the regulations do exist. There's no challenge with that. Then category 3 are who you would call new markets. The regulations are either very old or non-existent. Some of them are just governed by a few lines in the actual Electricity Act. So you find that, okay, how do we assist all these African countries? First, we came up with the regulation guideline templates, which then led us to this Africa Model Mini Grid Regulations tool. What's its interesting new feature and the feature that's loved by people who have used it, and that's strangely enough even loved by the African Union Commission because we launched this tool in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia last year, is that this tool has the ability to draft mini grid regulations just by simply answering a set of questions in a very short period of time. We can move to the next slide, please. And so this basically means that you answer progressively the questions in the tool. The questions have a lot to do with different aspects. They have to do with in terms of ownership models, in terms of technical requirements, in terms of regulatory independence, in terms of so many other things. And once you do that, you're then able to have different aspects of a mini grid regulation, a draft mini grid regulation. And we can move to the next slide. So once you're able to do that, you will then be able to understand how easy it is to draft a mini grid regulation tool. However, perhaps I should mention a bit of an implementation status on this tool. First of all, this tool has been used in Lesotho, it has been used in Zimbabwe, it has been used in Somalia by our partners, and it has also been used in Abia State of Nigeria. Those of you who follow the happenings, and I'm sure Malik would share more on this, if you ask him, the way regulations are now in Nigeria is that the different federal states can actually do their own energy regulation. So one of those states has used this tool to try and develop draft regulations. In terms of developing the regulation, this tool, we had to speak to regulators, and we had quite a number of regulators assist us. You can see Togo, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Kenya, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, all at different levels of maturity, but every one of them had something to add to the regulatory aspects. And of course, we had our delivery partners who were T, the Transforming Energy Access, and FCDO, as well as Get Transform. The consultant in this case wasn't the ASG, the Africa Energy Services Group, but GFA. And this tool has been reviewed by the IFC, Get Invest, World Bank SMAP, COMESA, CLAB-ER, UNDP AMP, and then AFDB, SEFA. And we have had a few implementing partners who have used this tool in different areas, INENSUS, as well as AFDB, SEFA. We can move to the next slide, please. So, getting into our session, we need to understand the difference between a policy and a regulation so that we can understand why regulations are very important. A policy is pretty much a guiding principle, the strategic objective of the government. It's more like a framework for decision-making and planning, and it tends in most cases to be aspirational, very general, very broad. This is where you find, this is our national electrification strategy. This is how we intend to bring the private sector to participate in the rural electrification. That's how it can be looked at. But now when you come to the regulation, these are legally binding and are often created by government authorities to implement the policies. So you will find in most cases, the regulators have the authority to create the regulation from the policy. So basically they ensure compliance, and they tend to be very detailed, very prescriptive, and I think this also goes to why very few people like doing the draft. They should go down to the very most minute of detail and information. Now, when we look at examples, here you have things such as what are the licensing agreements, what are the rules governing tariffs, what are the compensation mechanisms for when the main grid arrives. So you see why it becomes important for a lot of detail and prescription to be given. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, when we look at this and we come to Africa, and now this is based off the ERI by the AFDB, where 43 countries were surveyed. According to them, they found that 20% of the 43 had mini-grid regulations. That isn't a very good number if you think about it, if you even think about the mini-grid sector. That's not a very good number. 22% actually had national mini-grid programs. Then you could say 20% of these countries had mini-grid policy for private sector participation. Then 20% had technical and grid standards for mini-grids, and only 18% had specific licensing regimes. When you look at this as a snapshot and take into account the mini-grid sector in Africa, it doesn't paint a good picture. Nothing is above 25%. There are varying reasons as to why all this isn't happening, but just based off the AFDB's regulatory index for Africa from 43 countries, the mini-grid sector is still lacking in terms of robustness. And remember, when we were talking about the confidence factors, one of the things I said is clear legal and regulatory frameworks. So if less than 25% of these countries on the African continent, even though it's not all of them that have been reviewed, if less than 25% of them have these clear regulatory frameworks, how is it that Africa intends to attract the participation of the private sector into the mini-grid sector or the mini-grid environment? Because at the end of the day, the private sector thrives on clarity. So if this clarity is not there in majority of it, it becomes a bit of a challenge. And we all realize the mini-grid sector that actually, if we should stop using the word mini-grid sector, the electricity sector is expensive, not just for the grid and for the mini-grids. We can go to the next slide, please. So just looking at Africa in terms of maturity, here we're going to look at the highly mature markets, the moderately mature markets, and the lowly mature markets or nascent markets. The examples in the high maturity markets include Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, and a bit of Ghana. Here you'll find that there's a policy and regulation, there are standards, there are licensing rules. The tariffs tend to be clearly cost reflective, and mini-grids are in the national electrification plans, but there are also rules for grid arrival. Now, when you come to moderately mature markets, there are some frameworks, not in its full entirety. There are missing aspects, and there tend to be gaps in implementation. You will find there's no clarity about selling to the grid or dealing with the grid arrival. You'll find perhaps tariffs calculation isn't so clear. You'll find perhaps even the enforcement isn't clear. This is why we have countries like Mauritius, Mozambique, Gambia, Eswatini, Benin. But then when we move to the low, let's call them the low maturity or nascent markets, where I think private sector tends to say, okay, how can we go into these markets and build them up? Because in Africa, that's what happens. You also build up the sector. You find that there's no clear regulation, no policy, nothing is in place. There are no electrification plans that involve mini-grids or the private sector involved. And this is where most of Africa is. Yes, there are a few private sector players within the markets, but they're just few. And these are new markets, like we call them in simplistic terms. This is where you have the likes of Central African Republic, Seychelles, Guinea, DRC, Chad, just to mention a few. But I also want to point out that something about all this is that a country can be somewhere in between. It's very easy for a country to be between, let's say, highly mature and moderately mature. My own home country, from observation, from looking at it, is somewhere in between there. You could say another country also could be between low maturity and moderate maturity. Cameroon might be an example for low maturity, but I can argue, given the experiences, given what we have seen, Cameroon is closer to moderate maturity than low maturity. Now, the other question that tends to be asked has to do the interests of the private sector in that country. The private sector might not be interested in all countries for varying reasons. They have their reasons as to why they would love to go to more countries than the other. The current examples I can give, many private sector players want to go to Zambia. Many private sector players want to go to Madagascar. Those are ripe right now. Many private sector players are in Nigeria, in Kenya. But then when you look at other countries, then the interest isn't as much. The example I like to give in most cases is last year we were in Liberia, and the question that we asked ourselves, how is it that the private sector is not aware of how robust and clear Liberia is? Because I can say Liberia learned its lessons and follows through from Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone has a averagely or relatively mature market, and Liberia is almost at par with Sierra Leone. But if you look at the private sector participation, it's quite different. Sierra Leone has a lot, Liberia a little, and it comes down to the interests of the private sector and things like that. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, let me just give a bit of a summary on some of the markets. Like I said, Nigeria, most mature, very comprehensive regulations. Where in 2026, they recently reviewed their regulations in 2023. And there's a lot of regulatory decentralization, meaning there's no hoarding of power. And on average, the regulator tends to be very independent. When we go to Tanzania, there are numerous mini grids in Tanzania, the models, the ownership models. There are various owner categories, and it's one of those mature markets, but faced challenges due to political reasons. Of course, it was one of the countries that had a lot of early development for mini grids. When you look at Zambia, Zambia is leading in terms of innovative approaches in dealing with the issues of the private sector in the mini grid sector. They, just like Nigeria, have recently reviewed their mini grid regulations. When you look at their targets, they have clearly stated them out and they are within their electrification plans. Then we go to Ethiopia, for example. This is another country with innovative approaches to dealing with mini grids for the private sector and even for the local electrification agency. But their regulations, just like the other two I mentioned, have been recently reviewed. And just like Zambia, they have clear mini grid electrification targets. So you see why that plays a very key role. If there are clear mini grid electrification targets, it becomes easier for you to bring on board the private sector. But also it becomes necessary for you to have regulation. Because if you don't have clear targets, you start to ask yourself, why should we regulate? Why should we determine how this sector is governed? But of course, one of the countries I would say right now that has recently reviewed its regulations, I would say the most recent review of the regulations is Sierra Leone, which reviewed them just last year. I would like to point out that there are a few gaps in terms of data in the continent when it comes to regulations. In many countries, or some countries of the African continent, national electrification plans only cover grid-connected systems. They tend to overlook the mini-grid side of things. Yet the mini-grid, in its definition, a mini-grid is a smaller grid, is a smaller part of what could be considered a national grid. Secondly, there are a number of countries, those listed in the AFDB regulatory index, that do not have electrification plans, or at least they don't have these plans, including mini grids. So those of you who have interacted with me a lot, you realize I like to say that mini grids are new on the African continent, but not exactly new. They might have been around for some time, but it's still something that people are coming to grips with, because countries are coming up with their plans, but then they somehow overlook mini grids, yet mini grids are going to play a key and important role. However, when it comes to the licensing or registration regimes for mini grids, they exist in many countries. However, the technical codes tend to be very few. So it's clear, okay, this is how we will do this. In terms of mini grids, this is how we'll license them, this is how we'll register them, but there are no clear technical codes, and it becomes difficult in terms of knowing how to do it, how to size, or what kind of mini grid to bring to an area. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, if we look at Africa as a whole, the fact is Africa has about an electrification rate of around 40%. They say that there are 590 million people in the world without access to electricity, and 80% of them are within sub-Saharan Africa, hence things like Mission 300 and the likes. When we look at North Africa, the electrification rate is closer to 95%. When we try to break it down a bit more, and you'll see why mini-grid regulation is going to be important, countries with renewable energy investments come to about 70%. Africa is resource rich. I mean, the sun shines in Africa. We have plenty of running rivers. So we can take advantage of that renewable energy that can be used for mini-grids. However, in order to electrify, there's need for regulation. If you recall, in session 1, there was a point I did mention earlier in the day where I mentioned that one of the challenges we face in Africa comes from no regulations or completely different regulations. It's until you travel through the continent, you start to realize that the differences on the continent are quite fewer than the similarities. So you have a lot of similarities, which means there's opportunity for harmonization. And when I talk about harmonization, I do not want you to get it confused with standardization. Yeah? Harmonization simply means there's a bit of harmony. There are differences, yes, but there's that similarity, which is what we try to push, which is what we try to angle for. And even with the whole direction shift from the African Union Commission, the AUC, towards a single market and things like that, one Africa and things like that, it becomes important for harmonization to exist, not standardization. Standardization would mean what is done in Uganda should be what is done in Nigeria. That is impossible for different reasons. First of all, the sizes of the populations, the sizes of the economy, and things like that. That's why it becomes difficult. However, you can have a bit of harmony and similarity. Given, remember what I mentioned, that we're all aspiring to be what the most mature market is. So at the very least, we should all aspire to have similar regulations, but of course, taking into account the differences in our different markets. Because there are things, I'm pretty sure there are things that happen, let's say, in South Sudan that definitely do not happen in Zambia, that definitely do not happen in Zimbabwe, and most definitely not in a country like Morocco. So challenges of limited, why this limited regulation is still a challenge, and the harmonization on the continent. It is a barrier to regional trade and integration. It becomes hard to bring about what the AUC wants, us to fully regionally integrate. Even the private sector will tell you, an area with limited regulation, there's no harmonization, they tend to fear to go there. So it will be an unattractive environment. Yeah. Thirdly, there's also limited access to finance and technology. No one is willing to give you capital to go into such a market, because chances are they will forget, or they will lose their money. Then fourthly, there's inefficient utility performance. Most of us are in Africa. I can tell you, if we take off our technical hats, at least 90% of us on this masterclass call will say we're unhappy with our utilities. At least 90%. When you take off your technical hat and you say you are basically a consumer. But also this leads to energy access and affordability challenges, which then translates into environmental and social risks. Because there's no way, without regulation, you can't protect the environment. You can't, and we all understand that regulation, at the end of all things, and many people laugh when we say this, regulation is about disappointing all stakeholders in an equal and measurable way, because regulation involves so many people in it. So if there's no regulation, there's also social risk. People will take advantage of that kind of environment. There's also a poor data collection and transparency brought about by no regulations. And for Africa, this also translates into a slower green transition. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, what are some of the interventions that are taking place to deal with the issue of regulation? When we look at the African Union, you have the Africa Single Electricity Market. There's a push towards that. As AFUR, we've tried to address this through our mini-grid regulations tool and the tariff tool, as well as the guideline templates. You might not be interested in using the regulations tool, but the guideline templates can give you an idea of international best practice, what you should look out for in terms of technical aspects of your mini-grid regulation, what the legal aspects should cover in your mini-grid regulations, and what economic factors should be highlighted in your mini-grid regulation. Those are at the continental level. But then we move down to the regional level. We know that Africa has the East African region, the West African region, North Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. Power pools are being engaged. And I've interacted with many of them. The South African power pool, the West African power pool, East African power pool, Central African power pool. All these are pushing us towards harmonization because it's going to bring about trade within the region. And the vision is to ensure now that the regions trade with one another, which would then bring us into one continental body. Of course, the regulators associations are going to play a role at regional levels. You have the SADC Regulators Association, the ECOWAS Regulators Association, just to mention a few. But most importantly, there are general initiatives that are being taken on board on the continent. The first being capacity building for national regulators. You can't have a regulation when the regulators themselves don't have the capacity to follow and to grant the regulations that and to guide on the regulations that they are overlooking. Secondly, there are peer-to-peer review mechanisms. For example, I know that the regulators in Somalia recently visited the regulators in Kenya just to understand each other. How can we build our regulations to match yours and things like that? And not only focusing on general regulation, but also on mini-grids. We have quite a number of people who reach out to AFUR saying, okay, what can we learn from Nigeria and things like that? Through even our project, we've encouraged the different countries to learn from one another. You remember I mentioned the 14 different mini-grid presentations, giving an idea of the environment. The different countries saw the differences and the similarities. Thirdly, there is a bit of standardization of the power purchase agreement frameworks. This is mostly in places like Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. This will make it easier for different countries to understand the whole thing. Fourthly, the private sector is needed. It is hard. The truth is, it is hard for national governments to implement, to invest in the electricity sector. They cannot do it. Otherwise, there would be no need for the private sector. If they could, they would have done it. Why is it difficult for this? Because national governments have different priorities. The priority of the government might move to security, might move to education, to health, to things like that, which leaves the energy sector lagging behind. That means that there's a need for the private sector to be involved, most especially in the mini-grid and off-grid market, And now that means improvement of regulations in these areas. How do you improve regulation in these areas? And I'm very sure the one thing that all developers will say is, we want clarity on things to do with the tariffs. Yeah. Then there'll be also talk of interconnected mini-grid regulation, as well as PPP models. That's the private-public or the public-private model for rural electrification. Is there more that can be done? In my opinion, yes. In the general opinion of Africa, 100% yes. How can we align as in a Pan-African movement? How can we align in terms of regulatory issues and frameworks? This means we need to empower regulators and regional regulators, as well as continental regulators, to do their job. And when you talk about doing their job, we're talking about independence, because if there's no independence of the regulators in terms of governing the regulations, then you will find that in most cases, the private sector won't trust the decisions of the regulators. We also need to talk about the unbundling of the sector. There's too much vertical bundling on the African sector, in the sector. If you unbundle it, it becomes easier in terms of regulation. But if there's a bit of vertical bundling, then it needs to be transparent. There's also a need to embrace the digital revolution, whether we like it or not. Technology is ever changing, and we need to take it on board. There needs to be local currency financing solutions. Those of you within finance can mention it, that mini-grid developers mention the challenge of finding local finance to help them in their solutions. First of all, it would be cheaper if you have local finance. That's just a fact compared to foreign exchange finance. So how do we approach this? There needs to be clear regulations for the sector, which would then build that confidence from the local financial players to be involved within the sector. There also needs to be alignment at national and regional levels in terms of mini-grids, in terms of general general mini-grid regulation. We can move to the next slide, please. And so we come to the end of session 2, which, like I said, tends to be shorter than session 1, because regulation tends to be something people have to think deeply about. And here I would want us to get into an open discussion. I don't know if there are any questions, but also questions are welcome, where we need to look at things that, the question we need to understand, what can make a regulation investor friendly? And here I would want us to look at it from the perspective of continentally as Africa, regionally, Eastern Africa, Northern Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, or Southern Africa, or in a country-specific way. What, in your opinions, makes a regulation investor-friendly? And when we talk about investor-friendly here, you can actually even target it to mini-grids per se. So in my opinion, how it needs to be investor-friendly, it just needs to be clear in terms of what happens, how it happens, and when it happens. Because I know one of the key complaints of developers are the regulations stipulate a certain time, but in practice, people go beyond the time stipulated in the regulations. But I would like to hear from you if there are any comments on this. And if you have any questions on what I've mentioned so far, feel free as well.
Yes, thank you, Samuel, for that great presentation. I just want to add, well, not really add on, but just to encourage people to go ahead and just unmute or raise your hand and just ask away. And if you have any questions, maybe on the presentation by Samuel, you can just pop in your question in the chat box, but feel free to unmute and speak your mind and on what you think can make regulation investor friendly. Or if you have any questions with regards to what's been discussed so far.
Yes, I see a hand from Modestus. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name.
Yeah, you're correct, Sam. Okay,
Yes,
so
please go.
I appreciate your context of regulatory harmonization within the continent, and also your exposition on designing local currency financial solution. So I just want to link two of them together and see how your team will synchronize in such a way that as you are asking how to get private sector investment, both from local and international, I think that regulatory harmonization and local currency solution will make or make it attractive for private sector investment. So what are we doing in that regard? Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Modestus. So generally, it's about local and international finance, the forex risk. I think this also all goes back to what I mentioned at some point, that mini grids are new, but not new on the African continent. So you will find that many local financial institutions have heard of mini grids, but they don't know how they operate. They don't really understand them. They don't clearly understand how they are regulated, what's guiding them, and things like that, which in itself proves a problem. Because now that means if a mini grid is in dire need of money, they can't simply walk to a local, let's say, a local bank and ask, oh, I need this funding source. And then there's the other challenge of perceived risks of mini grids in Africa. I think most of us, and this for me was an eye opener at an event last year, where a developer actually said that some of my most profitable projects are in the Sahel region. And many of us cognizant with the Sahel region, those are the likes of Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. If you look at the international news, everyone says these are regions that are this is a region that's very unstable and things like that. So when you bring that perceived risk into the equation of people not having an idea of what's really on the ground, per se, or not really having an idea about a certain topic, they tend to attach a higher cost and make it more difficult to access their capital or their funding, their finances, which in itself now proves a problem. How do we address this? The onus is on us to tell our stories, to publicize our stories that this is happening. Africa is ripe, things are safe. If they believe it's not safe here, the truth is it is relatively safe in most of Africa. If they believe there's instability in most of Africa, it is relatively stable in most of Africa. We should vocalize that. And then we should actually encourage more interaction between the different stakeholders. I think you saw how I highlighted the number of stakeholders in the sector. There are a few who I didn't mention there, but there are quite a number. All those stakeholders are needed in the room in order to ensure that the story of mini grids is a successful one for the continent of Africa. I see your hand, Chima. Michael. Oh, okay. After Chima, after Modestus, you will make your point. Yes, Modestus, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your remarks, bringing stakeholders to tell our stories. That's very conclusive. Thanks.
All right. Now, first we'll go with Chima, then I think there's Richa. So Chima, you first, then we'll go to Richa.
Thank you very much, Sam. Happy to connect again, and well done to that very wonderful presentation. So, speaking on the open discussion, what can make a regulation investor friendly? I think you've said a lot on that, and it's very clear. But just to add that, in support of what you've said, I think few points. It has to be very fair to all the parties involved. It has to be very clear, predictable as well as transparent, and also, which is where we emphasize on, implementable. So why is dear to my heart is that we can have a very good, well-written, well-composed regulation, but it can actually not be implementable, right? Because of the kind of structure in place, be it at the regulator office or the agencies, as well as perhaps not aligning well with the other existing laws in the country, like the National Energy Compact, Electrification Plan. And from what we've seen so far, we've also seen, like, in instances whereby we know some countries where grid encroaches the national grid, but you will see that it's very difficult or being impossible for developers to be compensated. But if you go back to the regulation, it's very clear that look at the metrics, look at the factors, there should be some level of compensation. But we've seen instances where it's very difficult to be compensated, and that's why it's dear to my heart, and why we have to emphasize the need for countries not only to have well-written regulations, but we have to put structures in place to make it well implementable. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chima. It's great to hear that from you. Richa, please.
Yeah, I think my discussion also aligns very much with what Chima said. So I feel like sometimes even if there are clear regulations on paper, there might be discrepancies in how it's executed, right? So in my opinion, the execution of those written regulations should be more transparent. For instance, the additional transaction costs that may arise due to overlapping authorities between different institutions and some informal ways that can always intervene, like bribes and corruptions could come into the execution phase to speed up the process or to ask some favors from one developer to another. So this kind of things could also incur some additional hidden cost for an investor, and that could not make it as attractive as it could have based on just the regulations. So I think this aspects, which is not really addressed so much, should also be addressed to make it more investor friendly, in my opinion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Richa. That is an interesting take. Very supported. Yes. I see Aminata is unmuted. Please go ahead, Madam Aminata.
Samuel, just while we wait for Aminata to... Oh, okay. Okay, I was gonna say while we wait for them, do you still want to go through? And I see you have a couple of slides, so...
No. Yeah.
Okay, so they can unmute and ask away.
All right. Well, seems it seems that everything went okay, I guess.
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah. So I hand back to you at SSN.
All right. I know there's one comment that came through. Just thank you to all the speakers for the wonderful expositions to Samuel and the management of Sierra Leone and Electricity Regulation Commission will engage with you on the sideline. Right. I thought that would be a question, but thank you either way. So just to essentially, I won't be that long as well. So just to basically summarize what was spoken about today, topics, sessions that we covered. So it was quite an insightful conversation, masterclass, and we covered the tariffs, cross subsidies and community-based pricing. We also had an interactive discussion at the beginning, which was very insightful, and a lot of questions and comments happened there. Then presentation as well, the one that you just presented, Samuel, on challenges in your country, region, and what makes regulation investor friendly. I don't think I want to be long on that part, but I'll just wrap up and just to thank you all for attending the masterclass. And thank you for thoughtful questions and engaging contributions. And also, most importantly as well, just the person facilitating our conversation, Samuel and Malik, thank you so much for being part of this masterclass and sharing your insights. So what we're going to ask from you guys now, it will be the poll. So are you guys able to, is it in the chat box? Also, they can just QR code. Yeah. So if you are able, would you be like complete the poll for us, just like maybe 5 minutes? And then you can leave the meeting when you're done, but this would be really great if you guys can assist in terms of populating the post-event survey. I'm seeing people already, yes, seeing people engage with the poll. Really appreciate that. I'll just give you guys 2 more minutes. We need more people. The same way everyone was engaging, and when it comes to questions and comments, we need that engagement as well here. But in the meantime, is there anything, Samuel, from your side that you'd like to maybe say one more time?
No, really. Just to realize that, well, Africa is Africa, but perhaps our similarities are quite many compared to the differences. So embracing harmonization is the way to go, most especially with us trying to shift towards one general African market. So it's important to look at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I liked the comment of obviously not trying to make everything standardized or copy what other countries are doing, but the key point here is just to have some harmony, And then if Malik, you have maybe like something to say or that you'd like to say, also welcome while we wait for people to keep on populating and just engaging with the post-event survey. Please feel free to do so.
Okay, I don't think I have anything to say, except it has been a pleasure. And with regards to the mini grids and the tariff tool as well, we are all learning and we're trying to see how to improve the adoption of the tool. We have adopted it, but every day we are adopting it basically, and then we're trying to improve it. And then we also reach out from time to time to AFUR, to Mr. Samuel, for aid on explanations of this tool. So we'll continue to do that, and for other countries who need maybe any help or support, they could reach out to us. Our channels are open, and then we could see a way in which we could pass on whatever it is we learned, challenges and lesson learned to everyone. And then, yeah, also we'll be reaching out to those who perhaps maybe have a different experience with us so that we could also learn from everyone. So thank you very much, and have a blessed day.
Thank you so much, Malik, and thank you everyone who joined today. I think that's about it. Seems like a lot of people have actually completed the poll. When it comes to post communications, communications will be shared in due course with everyone, so don't worry about that. So I think that's about it. Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate this engaging and thoughtful masterclass, and have a good day, everyone.